Between 1943 and 1945, 21 POW camps housing Axis soldiers captured during World War II were established in Minnesota. Prisoners from these camps proved to be a valuable source of manpower for agriculture, logging, and small businesses. Dean Simmons wrote a book about this absorbing episode in Minnesota's history called Swords into Plowshares.
This is a story that most people actually don't know much about. Most people, when you talk about World War II, had no idea that we had prisoners of war in the state of Minnesota. My name is Dean Simmons, and I wrote a book titled Swords into Plowshares. The book's about the prisoners of war who were held in Minnesota during World War II. Well, my interest began, I was originally from Olivia, Minnesota, and when I grew up in Olivia, there were people that were alive when I was younger that talked about the experiences of the Italians and the Germans being there. So I started at quite a while ago, actually, interviewing some of those people, writing down notes and so forth. Then, years later, I was an exchange student in Germany. And I then took it upon myself to try to find some of the prisoners, and I found a number of prisoners then who were held in Minnesota, and I went and interviewed them. And then it amassed into an interesting story about how the prisoners interacted with the Americans, how the Americans needed their labor at the time, and so forth. This story became an accumulation of a lot of oral histories about people's experiences with the prisoners during the Second World War. So when we're talking about the prisoner of war story, it's really that first moment in North Africa with the surrender of the Afrika Korps troops, which brings about the whole prisoner of war story in Minnesota. What people often forget is what happened, for example, with those troops that surrendered in May of '43. So at that time, Britain, whom had captured them, couldn't take care of them in North Africa. They couldn't bring them back to England to take care of them there. And so at this time, it was America was bringing war supplies to North Africa in Liberty-class cargo ships. And then they were going back to the United States empty. So the United States then, the custody of the prisoners was transferred from the British to the Americans. The Americans then started loading up these prisoners in these Liberty-class cargo ships, anywhere from 500 to 1,500 prisoners on each ship going back to the United States. And that also helped actually with the shipping of the goods at that time because the Germans knew the prisoners were being transported on these ships. So none of those Liberty-class cargo ships were bombed during the Second World War. In fact, it was considered probably the safest transatlantic travel at the time. Camps were established for multiple reasons. The logging camps up in northern Minnesota were there just for primarily harvesting lumber. But that was an important war commodity at the time. It was used for, some bombs had paper wrapping around them. There were shipping containers, paper products, all of those things were for the war effort. Some camps were more for farm-related work, or brick and tile companies. In New Ulm, for example, the prisoners worked in some brick and tile locations. Nurseries, they helped out down near Fairmount at the Elmore Nursery. The prisoners worked there. So in those situations, the camps would have been open year-round. But primarily, if you were to look at the Minnesota experience, the prisoners were predominantly used in the canning operations for peas and corn. Also notable was the sugar beet harvest up in the Red River Valley. So we had Ada, Crookston, and Warren, Minnesota camp locations were there primarily to supply labor to harvest the sugar beets that were there. Yeah, the treatment was pretty good. The United States adhered very closely to the Geneva Convention. So the prisoners were taken care of basically on an equivalent nature as the soldiers, the American soldiers, were here. So there were times when, for example, prisoners would arrive at a camp and they didn't have barracks lined up for them. This was down south. But to give you an idea of to the extent that we went to take care of the prisoners, the United States actually moved the American soldiers, the guards and so forth, out of the barracks so that they were on equal par with the living conditions of the prisoners. As it turns out, the German High Command had sent a directive to the prisoners held in the United States that it was in their best interest to work. And they were paid. They were paid the prevailing wage of whatever the labor was in the state at the time. So typically they would hold a wage hearing in these communities about what the wage rate was for this particular type of labor. And then the prisoners, the money then was given to the government. The government then maintained their living quarters, provided them food, medical care, dental care, and then the balance of which then was given to the prisoners in a trust fund account in their name. Now, sometimes prisoners did go out of the compound. There was one notable escape out of northern Minnesota where 2 prisoners had escaped and the FBI was notified and local newspapers were running pictures of the prisoners. They were captured a couple days later trying to make their way down the Mississippi River. What was more common with the prisoners is they would leave at night and then come back. Sometimes it was never known that they left the camp compound, but sometimes it was. In Owatonna, for example, one of the prisoners had escaped and was picked up at the local county fair, at the Steele County Fair, riding the Ferris wheel. So there were these instances where prisoners would get out of the compound. So I think, the overarching lesson, theme, legacy of this whole story was treating them decently. In the long run, we sent sort of messengers of our process, our way of life back to Europe and helped rebuild Europe out of that dictatorial background that it had experienced for such a long time. It's definitely a piece of Minnesota history that's unique. When one has an opportunity to visit and get some of this information, if it's not obtained early enough, it's gone forever. And one family whom I had been in contact with had photos at one point in time when I did a follow-up with them to obtain and get copies of the other photographs. They had since been thrown out accidentally. So sometimes these things happen where if there's not an effort made to collect the information at a certain point in time. And for me, I was kind of in the right place at the right time. I happened to be an exchange student in Germany. I spoke German, I speak German. And so I was able to take advantage of my location and my skill set at that time to get a lot of this information put together into one concise publication.